Hello and welcome back to a special edition of GNAT-TV's In-Depth series. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director at GNAT-TV's News Project. It's a pleasure to have you with us today on Friday, January 27th. We have a really interesting show, I think, for you today, one that will explore a topic that, well, needs more exploring, I guess. And that's the question of gender equality from the standpoint of helping young men and boys overcome some of the struggles that they are having. I think it's fair to say over the past 50 or 60 years, let's say, a lot of attention has been focused on the subject of gender equality, but mostly from the standpoint of how to help girls and women to achieve equality and parity in the workforce and life in general. But at the same time, I think it's becoming clearer that boys and men are also facing struggles, and many of them have a hard time talking about that. There have been a lot of very rapid cultural and economic and social changes that have come through over the past few decades, and some of them have not always impacted young men very positively. So here today to talk about that and some other related issues, we're really pleased to have with us today Dr. Bob Hemmer, who is a psychologist who specializes in child, adolescent, and family psychotherapy. His practice is based here in Manchester. And also great to welcome back Jason Pergament, who is the director of the Student Success Program at Burr and Burton Academy. Gentlemen, thank you both very much for making the time for this conversation. Really, really good to have you with us today on this important subject. I mean, there are a couple of metrics we could look at in terms of education and workforce and crime, but I think let's get right into it and have you both tell us a little bit about what your thoughts are on this subject. And Dr. Bob, let me start with you first. Why is it that you think boys and men seem to struggle more than, let's say, might have been the case 50, 60, 70 years ago?
Well, I think that, as you said in your intro, society is really changing, and while we're catching up in some areas, we're specifically not catching up in other areas, and that has to do with men and what they are struggling with. And then, because we're men and we're struggling, we typically tend to dismiss that because, the masculinity aspect of this is to minimize our problems and just forge down the path.
Okay, Jason, what are your observations on the subject? You get a lot of opportunities to really get a close-up view of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty clear, at least from the education standpoint, that the young women are excelling. They're taking advantage of opportunities. They're more often going to be at the top of the class. They're getting more scholarships, going to college more often, which has been all positive trajectory for that. And I think the role of the male is becoming less defined. The traditional roles of the male no longer apply. And so I think in a lot of situations, the young men know that they can't just fall back on traditional roles, but they don't know what the alternative is, because it's not necessarily, while now all these fields are open to women, yet traditionally female fields that the young men are not eager to go into, right? We do see some men in nursing, for instance, but we're not seeing a balance happening to make up for the voids, So I think the young men are just struggling to figure out what it is they're supposed to do. Yeah, I think one example that we gave in our previous conversations is something so simple, but it comes to things like holding the door, right? And
Yeah.
you're a young man, and traditionally you hold the door for everyone that's younger than you, especially people of the fairer sex, and those rules don't necessarily apply. Now you can hold the door to be kind. If someone's right behind you, you're going to hold the door for them. But now you need to really think, well, if I hold the door for this other person, what are the other messages they may be receiving? Am I holding the door because I think that they're less than me? Am I holding the door because I'm hitting on them? Is it, and it's kind of a simple thing, but I can see that's a microcosm of the overall experience that the male might be trying to parse apart as they navigate day to day.
Back when I was in high school, that was definitely a much less complicated question. And I think it's important probably to say at the outset, I mean, I don't think the purpose of kind of drilling down through some of these issues is to turn it into some sort of zero-sum game. I mean, obviously the advances that young girls and women have made over the past, let's say, 50 or so years, and before then, that's good. The point is not to kind of, raise up problems that young men are having at the expense of women, but to find a way to elevate both. And so just to kind of be crystal clear on that part of it. But I just wondered, one of the books I was reading as we been talking about this is this book by Richard Reeves of the Brooklyn Institute of Boys and Men. It's received a lot of attention, a lot of reviews online, and one of the points he makes in the middle of the book is when you look at the academic side, and that might be an interesting place for us all to start, is that one possible solution to helping young boys kind of get a better start in the school system is to, as he puts it, redshirt them. It's a football term.
Right.
Hold them back a year. Have them start kindergarten 1 year later than girls do, because developmentally at that point, girls are more evolved. Does that make sense to you guys? Do you think that would be one possible way of at least beginning to unscramble this whole thing, or is that kind of, that's not really getting at it?
I mean, I would always caution against any kind of blanket statement, like all young men need to start a year behind, right? But I do think there's something to be said about maturity levels. I think it comes down to, we talked about you going to teacher's college, and we share that in common, right? From a pedagogical standpoint, differentiating how you teach and understanding that young boys and young girls, have some biological predispositions, and trying to tailor an environment that meets everyone's needs.
Right. So if you tail onto that in terms of the psychological development, there's kind of these competing forces where, by standards, elementary schools are required to teach you X, Y, Z. You must be able to read. You must be able to put commas in the correct place. But rather than red shirt boys, which is kind of like labeling them, giving them a disability. One way I was thinking, just after reading a bunch of stuff in preparation for this event, is that maybe what we should do is move towards a more K through 6 non-graded system, where you're in here, this school, and you're going to be learning stuff, and it's going to be based on criteria, not your age. Because one of the big things you run into with that is, well, the boy is 5 and the girl is 5, well, he should stay back automatically. And I saw that in some of the research here, and I was surprised this research came out of Stanford, and they're really kind of starting to push this, where boys start kindergarten later. So I do kind of disagree with that, but the idea of you come into a school building and you're here, and when you meet these standards, you can move on, right? So
with the terminology right now that's kind of up and coming in education, both nationally and within our state, is proficiency-based learning.
There you go. Yes.
So you look at what a person needs to do to get to step 1, and then you scaffold off step 1 to step 2, and you just take each individual as the human they are, and you strive to help them meet those proficiencies. I do think, just as we've spent a lot of time building up young women and building their confidence and their self-advocacy, I do think now we need to look at the young men and build up their emotional sensitivity, the capacity of young men to talk about their feelings. I think we have to give them the skills and the tools to navigate an evolving and dynamic landscape. We can't, there is the traditional role of the male in the alpha role. I know you talk about the alpha beta, right? And that's no longer the truth. But yet still dads will interact with their children. I have a baby son at home, and I try not to interact that way with him. He has a pink swing, and I'm totally okay with that, right? But the traditional way that fathers and sons will interact is different than fathers and daughters. And I think I was really intentional not to treat my daughters like princesses, and I need to be also equally as intentional not to treat my son like a prince, and that to understand that he needs to be seen as the young person he is, and tailor to his own individual needs.
So in terms of that concept of alphaness, which is promoted, I was reading this article in The Varsity, which is a publication out of England, and they were describing the alpha-beta dichotomy. And there's so many dichotomies these days, we really need to work on that. That's a whole separate topic, I think. But alphaness in males is they are perceived as incredibly independent, disagreeable, socially dominant, sexually prolific, physically superior, and this is just a bad caricature. I mean, and then if you look at other studies about males, the people that load out to be on top in a lot of organizations is the people that are more pro-social, whether it's male or female. So the perception and the caricature and what's actually out there for boys and men to do is completely different. And I think this also causes stress, and that leads to the whole thing about what you said earlier about crimes and drugs and bad health outcomes, because us guys, we're not only not sensitive, we don't take care of ourselves.
We're bulletproof.
Yeah, I wish.
Well, you know, one of the things that struck me, well, three things struck me and a lot when we were, after we had our first conversation about this, and I was sort of looking at some of the metrics about this whole situation is, you know, right now, you know, starting in high school, girls are more likely to get a high school diploma than boys. I think the gap is about 6 percentage points, and you go on through college, 15% more students in college right now in undergraduate school are women than men. Graduate school, the same level of difference. You look at the labor force participation rate over the past 50 years or so, it's the male labor force participation rate in the prime age of 25 to 54 has fallen about 10 percentage points. And in COVID, it fell even more. You look at crime, 95% of the prison population of the U.S. right now is male. Only 5% is female. So what is going on there? You know, but I guess I just was thinking, to build on your point there, Jason, from a moment ago, you were saying how, you know, right now it's still not kind of accepted really for men to become, let's say, nurses or even in teaching. And I guess I just wonder how can we turn that around? How can because there's so much evidence to show that having men as teachers, particularly in the elementary grades, would be really advantageous to a lot of young boys. And to have male nurses is also a great thing too, because we all know there's a tremendous shortage of nurses, right? Good paying jobs.
Yes.
I mean, I think a lot of attention was put into redefining what it is to be feminine and to uncouple being a successful female from being a mom. You can be both of those things, right? It used to be you pick one or the other. Now it's both, and they shouldn't in any way preclude each other. Well, I think the definition of what it is to be masculine needs to be redefined, I think, and it needs to be done in an intentional way. I think what's happening is we're having to come to grips with toxic masculinity. I've had to come to grips with my own, you know, childhood and how I was raised and what I've learned from society around me. And so if we need to uncouple, you know, a male not being only alpha, right? Like, it needs to be okay for a male to have multitude of roles, and that's going to take a shift in society. I think it's going to take an intentionality towards the role of male. What does it mean to be male? And I think we're facing, I mean, right now is the perfect time for this conversation. You know,
it is.
The Me Too movement has come forward and has really highlighted the worst of toxic masculinity.
Yes.
The worst outcomes of generations of toxic masculinity, and we have to now come to grips with that. And it's, you know, it's one thing to say I'm sorry and to try and do better, but it's another to prepare the future generations and to redefine what it means to be masculine in a way that is not toxic. And that's going to take time, right?
And then there's the whole level, that idea of the caring professions, you know, and then there's dichotomies within that. Men are doctors, women are nurses, right? That's the way I grew up. And that's changing now, but maybe some sort of a refocus on the profession, not masculine or feminine, but a caring profession in which you can get involved and be a helper and be part of that. I think that there is this idea of how do we restructure this for an understanding that it's not a dichotomy.
I wonder if you both think, you know, the pandemic era that we've been going through, and I guess are still going through, does that create like an opening for some of this? Did that, you know, there was so much upending that happened with COVID, and, you know, jobs becoming remote and all kinds of things changes. although I remember clearly hearing, particularly in the first year or so, that, well, more women than men were forced to leave their jobs because childcare responsibilities kind of came first, and there was a bit of, I read a fair amount about that over the time. But I guess I just wondered, does that give us an opportunity to kind of, do some of the rethinking around some of this that gives us a chance to move forward?
I think it does, because COVID is an equal opportunity employer, right? I mean, it doesn't matter race, gender, anything. You could die, and I think that the concept or the research and the news articles that are coming out today, where everybody, whatever you are, there's a lot more anxiety, a lot more depression out there, and I see that pretty much every day in my practice with kids. And but I think this is a good time to do that, because we need to we have deficits in certain employment areas, and we need them filled, like nursing and teaching, and we need good, quality, highly trained people to be in that, and all sexes, no matter what your preference is, need to be in there and helping with people that need help.
Well, and here's the problem, though, that nationally, the trend is that teachers are leaving the profession in droves, and it's because one, it's an exhausting profession. Two, we're dealing with this outfall of COVID in behaviors and mental illnesses, absenteeism, and that doesn't just affect the boys, that's across the board. What you're seeing, all these teachers leaving the profession, and then there's, of course, the question as to whether it's a respected profession. So if being masculine means at least being a provider and taking care of your family, well, you can't do that in a profession that doesn't pay you well. Right. So now people are saying, oh, I could make just as much money waiting tables as I can being a classroom teacher. And I don't take my job home with me. I don't have to worry about the traumatized children. I don't have to chase after parents. I go to work, I make money, I come home. And so it's going to be hard to convince anyone to be a teacher right now, let alone trying to make a move with men into the field. So it does create an opportunity, I think, because there's a void, and someone's got to step into the void. And I'm seeing young people, I'm seeing kids graduating high school with aspirations to be in education, male and female, and so I'm hopeful, optimistic for the future, but it's going to take time. And I think, unfortunately, there's been way more drawbacks to the fallout of the COVID years than opportunities. I think, like I said, absenteeism is a huge one. We sent everyone remote, and we're having a real hard time getting them back. Mm-hmm. Kids who got very comfortable behind their screens in their bedroom, now we're saying, come back to class, there's no more screen option, and they can't.
I think Amazon's having the same problem.
Yeah, they can't. People don't want to go back to work. They don't want to go back to the grind.
Goldman Sachs is having a problem with that.
And I think, as adults, we understand that the COVID thing was a temporary solution to a problem, but if you're a young person and those 2.5, 3 years are at a transformational time in your life, your 6th to 8th grade years, now you've changed your entire perspective. I think, I remember being home and on the lockdown time and building a wall for my stepkid's room, or being outside and building a fence for the goats and the animals, and this is fun. I like being at home. I have all this extra time to do things that are personally fulfilling and mentally stimulating, and not punishing like teaching can be, like being in counseling. Dealing with but then when the switch got flipped and I had to get back to work, I was an adult and I knew how to do that. But as a young person, that's really hard. And then if you're a young man and you're having to come back into a system that is not really designed to meet you where you're at, or it's it's designed to kind of put you in a box, it doesn't feel good, and they're going to resist it.
I wonder, one other aspect of all of this that's kind of intriguing and way more complicated to kind of probably drill through completely than we have time left for, but that's the role of fatherhood. How that's changing. I think back, to my childhood. my dad was a great guy, but basically he was the breadwinner.
Yep.
My mom was a stay-at-home mom. He went off to work. Actually, he worked the night shift from 4 to midnight, so I didn't even see him very much because by the time he got home, I was asleep, and then I went off to school and he
Right.
was asleep. But he made time for us on the weekends and everything like that. But it was very clear what his job was in
Right.
terms of the family. I guess I find myself wondering if that model even really works anymore. I mean, now we need two-income
Right.
parents just to kind of pay the bills and float
The
the
economy,
financial
yes.
boat.
And men need
so
to
that
do
whole
their
model
part.
is-
Men need to, I was 10 minutes late to the interview because my infant, my baby son, Ivan, is sick. He's got a fever. And for the last 4 days, it's been me and my wife, Lisa, taking turns of who's staying home.
Right.
I stayed home, and then she stayed home, and then I stayed home. And
Yep, I did that.
it has to be that way.
It has
You
to
know,
be
we
that
have to evolve our thinking that the man is not the breadwinner, because we do need to have two incomes to make
Yes.
ends meet. And so the value of the wife's profession is equally important to the value of the man's profession. And again, that's that shifting role of what it means to be masculine. To me, it's masculine to be able to nurture my son.
Yeah.
And I think my dad provided.
Right.
I wouldn't say he was nurturing. I think he loved me. I know he loved me, but
Right.
I don't think he was nurturing. Wasn't his goal. That was for my mom to do. But now, we all have to
No.
nurture, and hopefully, I'm setting a model for my son that when he becomes a father, it's not even a question about whether he should nurture or not,
Right.
because I'm modeling that for him. So he's growing up in a world where men are also nurturing, and we can start to change that definition.
Yeah, and I talk to a lot of dads about that. I mean, just what I tell them to motivate us guys to do this nurturing work is, you put the time in now, and you'll save yourself a lot of difficult times when they're 16. Because then there's the arguments about, I want to go out, I want to do this, if you have a relationship and you work on that relationship, you spend the time with your kid, starting at birth. I've told a lot of dads, take your shirt off, take the kid's clothes off, except for the diaper, leave the diaper on, and take a nap with your child. It's really nice, it's really good, and it will put your child in sync with you, and you'll save yourself a lot of time when they're teenagers. I know this, I was very difficult as a teenager, but this will save you
Can't
time.
imagine.
You can't.
Yeah, really.
Who knew?
Shocking.
Who would have guessed?
And I think it's definitely. I don't think anyone would disagree that the kids that we see struggle the most come from homes where they're lacking stable, consistent parenting.
And yes, that's
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, kids who don't have parenting at home are going to seek guidance elsewhere, and often they end up seeking it
Right.
from the wrong places. And so, and more often it's the father who's not present.
Right.
Right? I mean, that's
Yep.
just how it's going to end up being. And so now a kid has a mom but doesn't have a dad, so he doesn't have a role model for healthy, nurturing masculinity. So he's going to look to his friends, he's going to look to the movies, he's going to look to music, he's going to look to sports. And there are athletes, there are performers who are great role models, and we can look up to them. But I would say a lot of times that's the exception. Oh, this one really stands out as being a good role model. That's a
Right.
surprise. But the rest of them are out there
because they all should be
giving
good
all the
role
wrong
models.
Yeah,
Yes.
they should be,
Yeah.
but they're out there giving the wrong messages. So now we
Yes.
have kids who think that it's normal to seek solace in a drink or a drug,
Right.
and that's not a good reason to drink or drug
Right.
to try and numb yourself or find solace. If it's socializing, if you're an adult, it has its place in most households, but that's not what we're seeing from the young people. We're seeing them seeking out unhealthy coping mechanisms to replace a void.
And one other point we haven't really touched on is the whole racial and poverty side of it. I mean, all of these issues that we've been talking about are I think even more difficult for minority group young men to cope
yes.
with.
But not exclusive to.
Not exclusive.
to.
So
Definitely.
there was just an article, a piece on National Public Radio this morning where they were talking about the suicide rate in males, and one of the, I believe it was a I can't remember the gentleman's name. He was from Harvard. He was a researcher, and he was Native American. And so he went back and sorted through the data, and if the rate for males in general was X, the rate for Native American males was like more than 2X. And so the idea here is, I think we really have to look at not only the masculinity problem here, but then across the races and cultures, and start figuring out what do we do in general with boys, and then what do we do with these types of boys and those types of boys, and how do we spread this out so it encompasses everyone? Because if I remember correctly, the last 2 shootings in California were people of Asian descent.
Older Asian men.
Older Asian men.
Still men, though.
Still men, but it was. I just thought that this was a new twist in the data set.
Yeah, that was interesting. Another thing that comes to mind as we're talking here, I've heard fairly often over the last couple of weeks and months how men have much fewer friends than women tend to do. We might have 1, maybe 2 close friends, but basically fewer than we would have had, let's say, when we were younger.
Right.
But women tend to be much more social and keep in touch with their friends.
Because the dad can't just go out to the bar and ignore his wife and kids at home and just socialize with his friends. No longer is Homer Simpson a viable model for fatherhood.
The alphaness concept of I'm home from work, I said hi to my kids, I'm going to go get a beer. That doesn't work anymore, and it shouldn't have even worked in the past. But that's
But now men have to replace it, right? They have to find healthy alternatives.
And that's what we need to figure out a way to give them the healthy alternatives, and maybe not even call them healthy alternatives, but call them the real alternatives.
Healthy options.
Which is the idea of this is what it takes to create life. This to move down the path and have a good life. There's all these studies now about happiness, and I agree with a lot of them, but there's this idea of how do we start this earlier, and how do we work this stuff into people, into men in this case, so that we don't get a lot of this toxic masculinity that we're dealing with today.
Well, there's a lot we can unpack in this. I'm thinking next time we bring you 2 back here, which I think we should, we'll have to have two ladies with us as well to kind of give another perspective on all of this. But unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there for today. Wow, really interesting subject, and we should have you both back to talk about some more.
That'd be a pleasure.
That would be a pleasure.
Anyway, that'll have to do it for today, folks. I want to thank you for being with us and sharing part of your day with us. Hope you found our program interesting, and again, want to thank Dr. Bob Hammer, Jason Pergament, for being with us to get us started on all of this. Thanks for being with us. We'll see you again the next time. Take care.